I've sat in so many brainstorming meetings where the focus is on doing everything in the moment and through verbally and loud dialogue. And there's this belief that the more chaotic the environment, the more creative the ideas. And this has been extensively studied. It's maybe one of the most studied things in business, and the results are just absolutely consistently it underperforms. It's shown that people who are extroverted are the only people who really generate the ideas. It's repressing the quality and the number of ideas for introverts in particular. But what they found is that when they tried different approaches, which focused more on pre-work and bringing ideas in for triage versus so that the creative acts and the generation of ideas happens outside of the meeting. And then the meeting is for triaging and sifting through to find the best ideas. Both the quantity and the quality of ideas are greater for both introverts and extroverts.
Welcome to Engines of Creation. I'm your host, Cristian Mastrodonato. The clip you just heard highlights a systemic flaw in how modern organizations attempt to generate ideas. We have built corporate environments that heavily index on volume and speed, often mistaking the loudest voice in the room for the most insightful one. But in an increasingly complex world, that bias is a massive blind spot that makes companies fundamentally fragile. Today, we are unpacking the mechanics of quiet leadership with Greg Weinger. Greg is a seasoned tech leader with over 25 years of experience in the space. He spent his early career navigating a corporate culture inherently biased toward extroversion, initially feeling like something was wrong because his natural instinct was to collaborate rather than dominate the room. In this episode, we dissect why the traditional brainstorming meeting actually represses the quality and quantity of ideas, and how moving idea generation to pre-work yields better results for both introverts and extroverts. We explore how introverted leaders act as a critical signal filters in noise environments, leveraging deep processing and strategic questioning to stabilize chaotic situations. We also discuss how senior leadership can intentionally re-architect team collaboration so organizations don't leave half of their intellectual capacity on the table. Before we dive into the conversation, if you find value in mapping out these complex dynamics, please take a moment to follow the show on your platform of choice. Leaving a review or sharing this episode with a fellow system thinker is the highest leverage way you can help us grow this collective intelligence. And now, let's go! Welcome, everyone, to Engines of Creation podcast. I'm here today with Greg Weinger, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Today, we are going to dive into introverted leaders. And Greg is an expert in the field. He has a podcast that talks about that. And today, we really want to dive down and see how introverted leaders can be great leaders that can help managing complexity. So let's start from the introduction, Greg. Welcome to the podcast, and can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, Christian. Really great to be here. I am a tech leader. So I've been working in the tech space for 25 plus years. I've been a leader for at least 20 of them. Long story short, the journey was rough for me. I was someone who was very achievement oriented. I did well in school. And so that was my model for success. And I was very surprised to realize as I got into the working world and out there that the things that made me really successful academically did not necessarily make me successful as a leader. And so I found out, because I was achievement oriented, I wanted to rise in a hierarchy and lead people. And I found that initially I was not encouraged. And I took this like pretty hard initially. It's like, well, what do I have to do? And I just, one way or another, I figured out how to become a manager and move into director positions. And, each time there were significant challenges that I needed to go through. And I always felt like there was kind of something wrong with me because I didn't naturally do the things that the models of leadership that I saw out there were doing, like it was not natural for me to dominate a room, just like dominate conversations. And, this seemed to be what everyone was encouraging me to do. That it wasn't just the model, people would tell you, all right, you need to speak up more, you need to lead and drive and all this stuff. And what ended up happening is I found my own ways of doing these things. I relied a lot on personal relationships and I was always collaborative. That I always lead with collaboration first. And I developed my own style. Things always felt you know, like a struggle. And inwardly, I thought something was wrong. It wasn't really until after I had become a senior leader, acting on executive teams and going through some coaching where I kind of reached a breaking point. I needed to figure out something needed to change for me to be successful in these environments. And I did some coaching, I did a lot of reflection, and I realized, and it was only then that I really came across the literature and the ideas surrounding introversion. And that had really grown up in the early teens with, especially with Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which really popularized the set of ideas where you kind of understand, okay, you're an introvert, what does that mean? And here's how you work with it. And it's not, something to be ashamed of. Then here's it basically became an owner's manual to my particular set of wiring. So coming at the other end of this, I thought, wow, I don't want anyone to go through what I went through, and not understand how they are, why they're wired, and, basically why the world is kind of biased against people who are introverted, especially in these leadership arenas. So I started my podcast. I appear on other people's podcasts. It's just something that I want to help other people with. So that's why I do what I do.
That sounds very relevant, especially because I think there are a lot of people that can relate, first of all, in that journey. And it's true sometimes that it's hard for someone who's introverted to grow and make themselves visible. But actually, my experience as a leader is also that introverted bring always a lot of value. And I think that's where I want to dive today. Of course, the lens of this podcast is more about managing complexity, knowing that the world where we are is complex. But I think we have a lot of good examples that you can bring on how introverted leaders can help to lead and to make good decisions in this complex world. So let's try to dive down and understand from your experience and your knowledge. And also, I'm sure also the many people you must have interacted to so far who are also
Mhm.
introverted leader and have knowledge how they can play out. I also want to stress for the non-introverted here that might be listening that some of these values, some of these behaviors, you don't need to be introverted. You might learn from an introverted, even if you're naturally extroverted, which is something I also picked up from your work. It's not just about who you are or what's your, I think introversion, extroversion is a tendency. It's not like
Mhm.
a binary,
Right.
and there is a spectrum. Actually, personally, when I do this sort of test, I always ended up kind of 50-50. I'm a sort of, I think it's called ambiverted or something like that, which it relates. In some things, I'm very extroverted. In other things, I'm very shy and more sort of reserved. So I definitely understand why that comes up. But I think it's important for the listeners to understand, okay, if you're not introverted, don't switch off, don't go away. There is a lot of value for you
Mhm.
as well. One is a leader because you are going to, even if you're extroverted, you're managing introverted. You want to take the best out of them and you want them to flourish. But also you can learn from them, even if you're an extroverted. I can tell you that. So now let's start diving down with some questions. One area I would like to start, of course, in a complex world, one of the topics sometimes comes up in some conversation is sort of signal versus noise. There is a lot of information coming from any direction, and in that sense, you can see that the market rewards sometimes speed and volume versus sometimes quality and capacity of sort of understanding. And so from this broader system perspective, really looking at how we can manage all this noise and how we can extract signal, is an introverted leader actually a filter for all this complexity as a natural behavior?
Yeah, I agree they can be, absolutely, and that's where one of the introvert's natural strengths can shine. You still need some skills to manage that because as you said, you're gonna be in situations and rooms where, the rapid response and kind of dancing on your feet is rewarded, and you need to be able to claim your space and claim time if really what is needed requires some more filtering and thought and time where you're going to be at your strengths. But I do think the introverted, mind, the perspective it can act like a great filter. We think about some of the great introverts in history. A lot of their contributions come from contemplation. You think about scientists, Newton, Einstein. These are very very introverted people, and they have their minds naturally deal with complexity well, and it's absorbing lots of information. This tremendous ability to be creative and invent new abstractions to filter through these things, and so that's what introverted minds can bring to lots of other situations that may be unique. If that makes sense. So it's really about claiming the space, and being assertive, enough to be able to make those contributions and recognize when you can really have a role to play there.
That's very interesting. And I would like to ask you, Steve, on this topic. I think everyone in our career can think one of those chaotic events or moments that can hit, could be sort of from a product perspective, but probably the customer, a new product launch or anything like that. And you can see, and you sort of alluded in your introduction, extroverted leaders, they try to force control and through action. And sometimes, as we say, it's sort of doing something is better than doing nothing, but it's not always the case. So from your personal experience versus also talking to other introverted leader, how does a quiet leader observe the situation in this chaotic element and behave differently and provide value?
Yeah, and so one of the approaches is by asking questions. So I found myself as a executive on an executive team. Frequently, there are at least three people in the room who are louder and faster speaking, and that than me. And so it's actually a challenge for me to break in because the way my mind works, I'm deeply processing everything everybody is saying, and so by the time I'm actually lagging the conversation by I don't know if it's a few seconds or something. But, this is a common experience from people I talk to. So in a sense, you need to pick your spots, and so it. I've heard another leader talk about this as letting the puppy tire itself out. So there can be a lot of energy about ideas and yes, this, that, and the other thing, and it's back and forth, and then at a certain point, there's a drop in the energy, and you can come in with strategic conversations. And one question can shift the conversation entirely. Entirely, it can shine a light on, oh, but the larger context. And I think this is something that introverts are really great at. And you do because you're first inclination isn't to just jump in. You want to step back and say, okay, what patterns does this match? What's really important here? You're always, in a sense, taking a step back, and so that's where you can come in either with an opinion or a question that has a major impact. And it's also kind of recognizing your limitations. Like the first thing out of my mouth is not going to be the best thing, so that's not how I make my best contributions.
I would like to expand a bit more and think from a perspective of the organization. And one topic that came up, in one of the first podcast episodes, actually, of the Engines of Creation, was a topic about collective intelligence from MIT
Hmm.
professor Gian Giacomelli. And I'm also thinking about the first conversation we had when we talked about innovation meetings, which they can be often a bit chaotic, loud, fast, and where it seems they are designed for extroverts. And there are a lot of these examples across a company. And so on the other end, if we think of any organization as a collective mind where you have multiple people contributing, you just don't want to lobotomize yourself, removing, let's say, 50% of the value that you bring,
Right.
just allowing these sort of behaviors to go on. Even if, of course, they don't come from a bad place, they come from a place of enthusiasm and wants you to
Hmm.
contribute. No one, I'm not bashing at all against introverted here, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's more about being aware that some styles sometimes tend to prevent others to contribute, and that doesn't allow an organization to take the full potential of everyone. So how do we actually re-architect the structure of team collaborations to make sure that the capacities we just talked about that introverts can bring of asking the right questions, for example, they naturally provide?
Absolutely. I think we're talking about the brainstorming meetings, and it's actually very literally designed by extroverts for extroverts, and that came out of the ad industry, and was a wildly popular idea. I've sat in so many brainstorming meetings where the focus is on doing everything in the moment and through verbally and, loud dialogue, and there's this belief that the more chaotic the environment, the more creative the ideas, the more ideas. And this has been extensively studied. It's maybe one of the most studied things in business. And the results are just absolutely consistently it performs, it underperforms like it, and it's not, and only, it's shown that people who are extroverted are the only people who really generate the ideas. It's repressing the quality and the number of ideas for introverts in particular. But what they found is that when they tried different approaches, which focused more on pre-work and bringing ideas in for triage versus, so that the creative acts and the generation of ideas happens outside of the meeting, and then the meeting is for triaging and sifting through to find the best ideas. Both the quantity and the quality of ideas are greater for both introverts and extroverts. So actually, everybody is generating better work when they're doing the work outside. So that has clear indications for what should be happening. You assign the pre-work, come up with 5 ideas, 5 to 10 ideas, bring them to the meeting. This is absolutely essential work in general. The way introverts are successful in these business environments is through preparation, by and large. You're going to be more prepared. You're going to have a full detailed agenda. You're going to have a set of talking points, bullet points to any discussion. And what that's doing is actually just kind of putting you on more equal footing in the room. You take the pressure off because it's not that you're not thinking in the moment. It's just that a lot of the maybe there's more of a scaffolding for the discussions. That's essentially what's happening in these idea generating situations.
I wonder, and it might not make any sense, but I wonder, you mentioned this is the brainstorm meeting is a meeting which is designed for extrovert to extrovert. And also that ideally we want to bring and make more preparation. But I wonder if you have examples where these sort of behaviors have been systematically embedded across companies.
You know, I I'm not sure kind of at the cross company level. I've certainly, personally done this and seen this in companies I've worked with where sections of the companies do this pretty consistently. I see this more in product engineering organizations, but my current organizations, this happens pretty regularly. I think in general, how do we make things more on an even level for all personality types, people who are introverts and extroverts? And a lot of this, the understanding starts at the very top level, at the executive team. If you don't have, generally it's the CEO primarily, but also the executive team, they set the tone for the entire company, and they have everything they do has ripple effects throughout the organizations. Any kind of cultural change has got to start with the senior leadership of the company.
Oh, I love that. And it kind of leads naturally to the next part that I want to talk with you about. So one topic that recently came up, well, it came up in actually in a few conversations, but I'm thinking now about the interview with Pascal Finat. And the topic was anti-fragility. And I don't know if you came across with this terminology, probably you did, but the
Hmm.
mindset for the listeners who didn't listen to the interview to Pascal, the mindset here is that an anti-fragile organization is an organization that can take advantage from change. It doesn't just resist change or it get crushed by change, but it can actually take advantage. And we can see a lot of, especially digital companies nowadays, are growing exactly because they are designed to be anti-fragile versus this how can I say, the standard organizational structure struggles to live in, especially nowadays, complexity and volatility in particular. I was actually related to that reading that the average tenure in the Standard and Poor 500 has gone down. I don't remember now the exact figures, but something from 60 year to 15, 12 years tenure, which just gives the idea of how fast the market is changing. So
Yeah.
speaking about leadership top down, the risk, of course, is that if there is the wrong leadership and the wrong role modeling, you build a monoculture where a certain set of behaviors are, of course, promoted, but that makes your organization more fragile to change because it's not adaptive. And do you think that actually creating a proper blend between all these different personalities is what can make an organization more capable to exploit the change and adapt itself?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. One of the things that I've learned in part of this journey is that the types of things that I have seen would make the workplace more inclusive of people who are quieter, people who might be hesitant to speak, make it safer for people to speak who may be hesitant for any reason. So you just run the gamut, you know, sex, gender, nationality, you're an immigrant. There's many different, there's neurodivergence. There are many different reasons why any one individual may not feel comfortable speaking in a dominant culture of one time or another. And these are just different lenses of that. And so that's one of the things I am out to promote is to how do you create these situations where you get the most out of everybody there because you've hired everybody there for a reason. They're there to make a contribution. They have all the experience and the intellectual qualifications, but it's very interesting what happens in these leadership situations where you start systematically excluding 50, 60, 70% of the opinions in the room. And that is, you absolutely do that at your peril. If you want to succeed, if you want to be anti-fragile, I absolutely believe that you need a diversity of ideas and you want the best ideas to win.
I'm thinking about your point earlier about the CEO or top down creating the right culture, because I think that that's very important. And of course, it's not about the CEO, it's about all of us, okay, in all our roles. But also thinking that not everyone is necessarily introverted, but they want to create this culture. Let's use the example of the CEO, but thinking it applies to everyone. So, how does a CEO successful model this quiet behavior to help everyone to understand this is the right way to behave right now and makes everyone feel welcome? In particular, if the CEO isn't introverted but wants to welcome these introverted views.
Right. Absolutely. So, I mean, recognizing not everyone is going to be an extrovert, and odds are that someone in a CEO position is not. Although we have very famous introverts like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who are obviously highly successful CEOs. It's really, I mean, it's general leadership, good leadership advice that you want to hear from your team before you share your opinion. You don't want to bias the opinions in the room. You want to legitimately hear everyone from your team because again, they're there for a reason and you want to hear what they think. And it's an important thing to recognize that some of your team is not going to naturally share their opinion. And so your job is to either draw it out of them or create the right situations where they are going to feel comfortable coming forward. And sometimes it's you know what's interesting is a lot of times people will jump in with their opinion if they feel very strongly, but that doesn't mean that their opinion isn't valid. It's just maybe they don't feel passionately about the topic, but you still really want to know as the leader what they're thinking because that could be the critical piece that you need to know. So I think it takes a lot of conscientiousness, and even I as an introverted leader will ignore that sometimes. Like I'll skip over that. I'll forget. Okay, well I haven't heard from this person and they're quiet, and so there is a tendency to keep speaking or filling the room with silence. I think that I think that there is a little bit of a fear that, or a natural dislike among extroverts for silence. And that can be something that introverts may or may not be comfortable with, but they're certainly, extroverts will want to just keep talking because that's uncomfortable. So I think that's a tendency to be aware of and fight in yourself, and just recognize, okay, sometimes the important point, or the person who's holding back and just hasn't really shared their opinion, is going to jump in if you give them the space to do so.
I hope by now everyone is convinced that introverted leaders can be great CEOs. Okay, so moving away from this conversation, I wanted to spend a bit of time focusing on some relevant skills, okay, that an introverted leader brings. They are not necessarily always available, I would say. Of course, you alluded already to some of them. Preparedness, the capacity to listen and ask the right question. A couple of skills also that came up in from previous conversations with you is also that I think are very relevant, and especially in the technology environment, they tend to be somehow, don't want to say dismissed, but not necessarily fully appreciated. Is skills like intuition and empathy,
Mhm.
which are skills that are sometimes hard to gauge or hard even to express, but it can be very, very powerful. And sometimes I think, for example, in case of intuition, it's often something which is sort of a form of subconscious pattern recognition.
Yeah.
And someone can have the time to listen to their own intuition and reflect. They can use that to have a better judgment. Am I wrong? Am I completely off?
No, no, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, part of this goes to what is an introvert anyway. Like, as you said earlier, it's a tendency. It's a tendency to go inward first. And that's with everything that's inward. It's to your body, your sensations, it's your thoughts, it's your emotions, it's all the sensory input that you're taking in. Instead of reacting to process what's happening, or, to relate in the world, you're going inward first. And so that gives you it can develop the capacity to have intuition across a broader range of inputs. And as you said, it may, because I've seen plenty of introverts who don't have it, but it can lead to deep empathy and awareness. So you can develop this deep situational awareness that you can bring to bear, that other people may not be reading the room at the depth that you are. People may not be looking at the long-term strategic view. They may not be bringing in creative ideas in the same way. So these are all potentials that could be developed, and so they can be brought to bear. And this is one thing I want to emphasize, is that all these strengths lend themselves well to contemplation. And so for a lot of introverted leaders, I think some are just naturally this way, but for most of us, you have to develop skills to be able to bring them to bear in leadership situations, in crowded rooms, in public speaking, in in stressful, chaotic situations. And so in order to do that, you have to develop new capacities that allow you to bring those strengths to bear in those situations.
Listening to what you just said, that made me think about a previous interview we had with Stephen Pure. And I think the focus there was about flow and state of flow. And of course, especially in a world where we tend to be constantly triggered by distraction. Everything is designed to distract us. Emails, like we are bombarded by this constant flow. And I don't know if it might be, I might be wrong, but I feel that someone who has this natural tendency to look inward might be better suited to resist this bombardment of notifications and distractions, or am I wrong?
It could be individual. I've always do have the ability. I've found I have a tremendous ability to focus, just speaking for me. I can shut out the world, but there's a cost, pay a cost in terms of energy. Like but it is a capacity I have. And so that's a good question. I know Steven. I interviewed him on my podcast. He's a sharp and very funny guy.
I think we touched upon some interesting tools for introverted and also non-introverted to improve the way we work together, to make the best of our skills, but also to make the best of the skills of our colleagues to create very, very powerful and successful organizations. And so I think that leads me to the final question that I
Okay.
usually ask all my guests,
Mhm.
which is what are the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity for you?
Yeah. So a leader who embraces complexity has the ability to be very calm in chaotic situations. They would have developed the skills to be able to take in the complexity, recognize it, and so what are those skills? I mean, one of it is really self-awareness, or you could even call it consciousness. And that's what I alluded to earlier, this awareness of your body and your sensations, your breath, your internal states, your emotions. And so there's sort of this mindfulness and even your thoughts, like an awareness of what your thoughts are doing because you don't necessarily have control over those. So there's self-awareness, there's situational awareness, which extends to empathy, that sort of thing. And then it's it's recognizing what does it take to truly understand and apprehend the complexity. And this is where we didn't talk a lot about bias. Like there's tremendous bias toward extroversion in leadership. It's just simply a fact. There's tremendous bias towards extroversion in our culture, Western culture. I mean, in America in particular, but you're in the West, and it's it's very prominent, and it's entirely culturally determined. It's different in Asia. It used to be different in America, like 200 years ago. It's culturally determined, but there's tremendous bias, and you need to be able to um, yeah, you need to be able to overcome that bias. And so how do you make sure that there's space to deal with the complexity? I guess the challenge with the bias is that it's almost never the case you need to make an immediate decision. And I just say this based on my experience being in, like 30 years in business. The war, as much as we love war metaphors, business is not a battlefield. And, I have been in calls and situations where like it's extremely rare that you don't have an hour, 2 hours to go back, think, gather data, come back and regroup. So the whole bias toward this whole cultural bias is just extremely misguided. And what we really need to do is recognize how are we going to make the best decisions possible. And introvert or extrovert, taking your time is almost always the right answer. Now, there's absolutely days, analysis paralysis, all this stuff. There's a lot to be said for a bias toward action and learning and making decisions, all that stuff. But that kind of takes it out of the realm of personality difference. Like, the personality difference, but I think the only explanation I can think of why we get so attached to it is that it's seductive. It feels good somehow to feel like you're so powerful that you can just make a great decision on the spur of the moment, and it's all your instinct and it's all on you. I think it's just these are kind of fallacies that as we have more and more education and more examples of people who are creating these open collaborative environments, that in seeing the success that they have, they're including more of their people, hopefully it's my hope that these views fall by the wayside over time.
One thing I was noticing in your final answer is that there is a common theme across the last interview in the podcast. You are joining a few other guests who are advocating for the capacity to slow down and think of consequences and not just rush and not just go fast and break things, which has become definitely over the last few years a kind of a mantra in many scenarios. And I think that that's very important. Is a message that needs to go out of taking the time to think. And as you said, it doesn't need to be 100 years. It can be just a couple of hours. Let's just not rush into that decision if you don't have to. And in particular, I love when you said business is not a battlefield, because it is so true. And we like sometimes to get into that hype and in that dopamine generating situations instead of actually slow down and think quietly. So that was very, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, we really do get addicted to the chaos. Now there's yeah, it becomes a bit of a seduction.
Yeah, I think it's a new thing maybe that I have to think about. Of course, the theme of the podcast is managing complexity, but it's also true part of that managing is not to get addicted to the
Mm.
chaos that sometimes is in a complex world. So, but that was very interesting. Thanks a lot. You gave us a lot of food for thoughts today. So thank you, Greg, for your time with us.
Absolutely. This was a fun conversation. Thanks so much for having me.